And I'm excited to have here with us today, actually, builders at the forefront of infrastructure and blockchain development. So the first question I have is actually for Nikil. So you're the CEO of Alchemy, and it's the largest developer platform in the blockchain. So let's start with, why is blockchain infrastructure important, and why is it important to bring Web3 to billions of users?
Yeah, this is a great question. Actually, funny, in a past life, I used to make consumer social apps, so it's very easy to explain. Now people are like, you do what? Like blockchain infrastructure? What is that? So the way to think about infrastructure and developer tooling more broadly and why it's interesting is, whenever you have a new industry, whether that's the computer, the internet, or Web3, you basically have this cycle of life. And what that cycle of life is not a scientific term, it's a term we made up. It basically, any new industry, you have people who build things, right? And those people build, in our industry, it would be applications. So let's say the computer. There's developers who come in, and those developers build applications, so things like Excel, Word, Chrome, whatever apps you use on your computer, and then users like us will come use those things, right? And the reason it's a cycle is because once you have those users come, more developers get excited because there's more consumers of their product, they have new ways to monetize, so more apps are being built, and so on and so forth, right? So when you think about this circle of life, the key part of the circle is, how do developers build products? Like, how do we make that easier for them to do? And the state of Web3 today is kind of like any early industry, right? When the first cavemen started building like mud huts. What do they have? They have a little stone, and then maybe like hit the stone and cut a piece of wood, and they're able to build a little mud hut. And today, we're able to build things like the Empire State Building or the Burj Khalifa. Why? Because we have construction equipment, we have cranes, we have front hoe loaders, we have back hoe loaders. I really like construction, so I know a bunch of these names. But basically, we are in an era where the most important thing we can do to bring Web3 to the world is enable developers to have those tools that they need to build applications. And the reason it's important is because that accelerates the cycle of adoption, and it ultimately makes it possible for people to build apps that anyone around the world can use.
Speaking of, so following on to this concept of like growing developers on the blockchain, the next question is for Tegan. So you lead business at The Graph, which is a decentralized index and query layer for Web3. So can you describe the state of blockchain development today? So how many developers do you think there are, and how quickly is that growing?
Yeah, great question. So we've actually seen explosive growth when it comes to the number of developers within the ecosystem. So within The Graph, we also provide kind of tools to allow developers to build and to improve the user experience, because we want these applications, these decentralized applications, to be better than the applications that are centralized on your smartphones today. And so within The Graph's hosted service, there are over 32,000 developers, and on the decentralized network, there are over 25,000 developers, so 57,000 across the two, and we're seeing like 35% quarter-over-quarter growth. So it's really exciting, and that growth on The Graph really speaks to the growth within the Web3 space across layer 1 blockchains like Ethereum, Near, we're working on Solana support, so really this 360 view across the different networks that exist within the space.
So let's say there's like between 50,000 and 100,000 developers currently building today. There's millions of developers, currently out there. One of the things we hear repeatedly is that it's still difficult to develop on chain. And actually for Bryan, since LayerZero is trying to make it easier for developers to build cross-chain, what's some of the root causes of the difficulty?
Yeah, when you're talking building on a single chain, I think there's a couple of things. One, it's just like a huge paradigm shift when you're talking like EVM and Solidity, going from the ability to like upgrade things to having it be immutable. Like you go from needing 95% correct is like probably fine, and we'll just like fix it and upgrade it, like 100% correct or it's entirely broken, and that is like really hard to design for and just like do in practice. So I think like that in itself is a challenge that like new people coming into the ecosystem struggle with getting right. And then the other thing is just like tooling. Everything, even now, compared to building anything in Web 2, like even EVM systems are okay, tooling's getting better. Like everything else is very, very early days of like developing. So I think
Can you actually go a level deeper? What kind of tooling do you mean?
100%. So like any like dev tooling, like take Hard Hat for example, like helped local development in EVM so much, and then like you just don't have that when you're building in the majority of other systems right now. So I mean, there's a ton that needs to be done. I think it's being done, and all the right incentives are there to like make that happen. But yeah, I think just generally it's a shift, like a pretty significant shift from building in Web 2. But resources are getting better. There's a ton of people super excited about it, so it will continue to get better. It takes time. Early internet development tooling sucked as well. So.
Takes time. And moving on to scalability. So Steven, you're the CEO of Arbitrum, which has the most traction of any layer 2 on Ethereum today. Can you describe a little bit about the limits of transaction speed on the blockchain? And what does that look like today, and where do you think it will be in 5 years' time?
Yeah, absolutely. The limits of transaction speed it's actually a common misconception. People think that if we have faster computers that do more transactions, that can process things more quickly, like that's the bottleneck. And it's actually not true at all. In Ethereum, for example, the parameters are set such that a vast majority of the computational power of a regular computer are way not used in Ethereum at all. What that means is in a 15-second block, about 200 milliseconds of computation is done. So why? Why are we not running at full capacity? What is the reason for this? And there are really two reasons. One is decentralization. We want to run at the speed of the slowest node in the network, and we want the network to be decentralized. So if we tune the parameters such that only data centers or really powerful computers can participate in the network, then what have we done? We've basically gone back to the Web 2 system de facto. Because anyone can participate in theory, but you really have to have a data center to participate, and most people are completely barred and locked out of the system. And that's exactly what we don't want to do here. We want to open up the decentralized web and allow people to participate, and the security comes from having many people be able to participate and run nodes. And it goes even a step further than that, because so even for the lowest computer on the network, we don't want to run at record speed, because the issue is syncing state. What that means is, if it takes me a week to run these blocks in Ethereum, if a new network comes on the node today, if a new node comes on the network today, how long should it take them to get up to speed? If it takes them a week to do a week's work of transactions, that's a big problem, because Ethereum has been running since 2015. And if you wanted to start a node today and it took you 7 years to get up to speed, it's a really big issue. So we prioritize actually being way under the compute power that we have today. And the key issue, and the one that is really I think a key research topic going forward, is solving this problem of state bloat, fast syncing, and also just growing the state in a more reasonable way. Because besides for the speed of syncing, it's also how much data is here. And now your little nodes are priced out again if the blockchain is growing too fast, and there are terabytes of data that you just need to be able to run a node and be able to access that relatively quickly. So at Arbitrum, we scale computation quite well, and we are about 95% cheaper than Ethereum today, and have about an order of magnitude of capacity plus that we'll bring on live soon in Arbitrum Nitro. But the big problem going forward, the problem is not the computation bottleneck. The big problem going forward is really the state growth, the state bloat, and the sync speed. And I think those are really important issues that we're working on, but they're really issues that are across every chain and really a community-wide issue to solve this problem. I think we'll make a lot of progress in the next 5 years. I'm optimistic about that.
I have a couple follow-up questions here. Can you describe the relationship between ETH2, which is launching, and layer 2 blockchains?
Absolutely. So people ask this all the time, like, are you guys, basically the question they ask me is a nice version of, are you just a Band-Aid? Like, are you here to get us until ETH2 and then you sort of go away? And obviously I say no, but I actually believe no, and we're not, because ETH2 scales the storage. What happens in an Arbitrum transaction, or any layer 2 transaction, is the data of the transaction is actually posted on Ethereum, and that's how we get the security. That's a critical piece of how we get the security of Ethereum in a layer 2. Our security is derived, and step number 1 of that is putting all the transaction data on Ethereum. And that means when you have a transaction in Arbitrum and it costs you, say, $1, the majority of that cost is just a pass-through cost to post data on Ethereum. What ETH2, one of the big things that's coming with ETH2 is data sharding and scaling the data layer. So the vast majority of our cost is that piece of just putting the storage on chain. That's going to go down significantly. And that's really, really helpful for us. Now, if you imagine a world in which like the demand was stagnant, this might be a problem for us because, hey, there's this data is much cheaper, we can do a lot more on Ethereum, do we need these scaling solutions anymore? But that's not the world which I think we're in, and I think the evidence is clear that the demand is only accelerating. And we're going to scale to the next billion, 2 billion, 3 billion users. We're going to need every piece of scale we can get. We need ETH2 to scale the data layer, and we need Arbitrum to scale the transaction layer, and we need solutions like state float and other fundamental research topics to solve other parts of the puzzle. So they really like fit quite well together, and this is not my view. Last October, about a year and a half ago, Vitalik Buterin wrote a blog post that said, ETH2's mission is roll-up centric. Arbitrum is a part of a class of scaling solutions called roll-ups, and ETH2's vision is roll-up centric. Arbitrum is a critical part of that, again, because ETH2 provides one piece of the puzzle, but if we want to actually bring blockchain to the masses, we need the entire puzzle to be filled out.
This is a question for any of you guys. What is sort of the transaction speed and volumes on chain today? And how does that compare with actually traditional financial services companies? Because I think one stat we hear a lot is NASDAQ processes something like 500,000 transactions per second. And social networks are processing millions per second. And so what's this gap today, and how fast do you think it'll take to get there?
I mean, Stephen touched on this a little bit. So in the blockchain space, there's something called the trilemma. And so it's decentralization, scalability, and security. Yeah, so you have these three pillars, and you can't have all three. So different blockchains have different trade-offs. When it comes to like Bitcoin is extremely secure, Ethereum, and very decentralized, Ethereum as well. And then you have blockchains like some within the Cosmos ecosystem, Solana, that are working to get to like NASDAQ speeds. So you have different trade-offs across different chains, and this is why interoperability is so important, because we will live in this multi-chain future. That's why bridges like what Bryan's doing is extremely important, other bridges like Nomad. We need those bridges because it allows you to take some of the funds that are on one chain or one layer 2 and move those to another chain, and you need security when it comes to those bridges.
Yeah,
So, go ahead.
I think one important view to take here is looking at the history of technology. I think there's always this question of, will blockchain scale to X number of transactions or whatever? But when you look at the early days of the computer, right, there's actually a really great video. I highly recommend you guys Googling it. It's Bill Gates explaining to this reporter in, call it the late 70s, early 80s, about why people will use this thing called a computer, right? And the lady is basically saying, oh, but what can it really do? Like, why is it better? And he's like, oh, you can learn on it and do these things. And she basically says, oh, but how could it ever possibly be better than a book? And he's like, well, you can have this multimedia and images, and he's trying to convince her. And the point here is that at the advent of any new technology, it always looks like a toy, right? If you actually looked at what a computer could do versus, a handheld calculator or these other kind of existing technologies that were there, it wasn't that much better, right? And the difference here is that there are a few technologies, namely in the last 100 years, you look at the computer, the internet, and Web3 or the blockchain, that provide a new fundamental primitive. And if you have that primitive, what it does is it enables a new type of ecosystem to come. So concretely, what the primitives are for the computer, it allowed machines to follow human instructions, right? Like that was never possible before. The second thing that came along was the internet, and that allowed machines to exchange information. And that was completely new and novel, right? And when you look at blockchain, what it does is allow machines to exchange value. And that was something that was never possible before. And a lot of the technologies that we see in the current day are actually derivations of those kind of fundamental building blocks. So if you look at something like self-driving cars or artificial intelligence or biotechnology, all of these are just the computer and the internet combined together, right? Blockchain is the first new paradigm shift. And the reason it's important is if it actually introduces new capabilities that were never possible before, there will be a whole horde of people, including all of you guys in this room, who are bent on improving that technology and making it look better, right? So I think this kind of question of will blockchain scale to X number of transactions is really a question of, do we think there's value in this new primitive that's being created? If so, technology will advance and people will make it better, and there will be a time where it becomes feasible and usable, right? In mass scale, and eventually like far exceed the current systems. And if it's not fundamentally useful, that won't happen, right? And I think everyone in this room believes that it is. So I think for us, the way we think about it, it's a when question, not an if question.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think it looks like a toy until it like changes everyone's lives, and we're really close to Web3 doing that. I would say close to the end of the year, early next year.
How do we drive more killer app developments on chain? To Nikil's point.
Should I take it? I feel like I'm talking a lot. All right. I think there's a couple things, right? I think there's two really important pieces. One is this kind of developer infrastructure that we already talked about. I think the other thing is you need to have use cases that people get value from outside the fact that it's a decentralized product or outside the fact that it's blockchain, right? Because inherently, whenever you say, I'm using a blockchain product, I'm using a decentralized product, you're indicating that there's not enough value in the product itself to be talking about the value. So concretely what this means, I'm willing to bet none of you guys went to dinner like last week and said, oh, you know, I used an internet application to call a car to take me to this restaurant, and I used a computer application to pay, right? And you're like, oh, I called an Uber and I just used like Apple Pay. So when the technology is abstracted, it's almost ironic. Like when you never hear about blockchain ever again, that will be when it has mass adoption and real usage, right? So, and not that it doesn't right now, but we're on a path to get there. So the two things in my mind that are actually very needed in order for the ecosystem to be used by every person on the planet is, number one, amazing developer infrastructure, which, you know, we're very lucky to get to work with all of these guys here, and they're pushing the envelope of technology forward. The second piece is you need concrete use cases that provide value to people's daily lives. One of the ones that I'm personally very excited from, you know, like we have this, so a little bit back on Alchemy, we power like a huge chunk of the entire crypto ecosystem. Whenever you open it and look at an NFT, that's actually powered by Alchemy. So one of the things that I'm very, very bullish on is NFTs. They look like a toy right now, because whenever you have a new technology, you kind of have this like skeuomorphic phase where you take the paradigm of the existing technology and bring it to new technology. So when you look at websites, right, what were the first websites that happened on the internet? It was taking your cookbook and recipes and putting them online. It was taking your yellow pages and putting it. How many people know what yellow pages are? Okay, this is a little. In our team, it's like our team's like, what's a yellow page? What's a phone book, right? So you take a phone book and put it online, and these were great. You know, it made the phone book marginally more useful. You didn't have to carry it around, and you can access it from anywhere. But that's not really what the internet enabled, right? That was just scratching the surface, right? And you know, internet enabled things that were internet native, like Uber and Facebook and DoorDash, that were never possible before. So when you look at NFTs, people are taking that skeuomorphic era. It's kind of the phone book era. We're taking digital art and putting it online, right? And that's interesting for sure. But what's really cool is that NFTs aren't just like digital art. It's actually this. It's kind of like a web page. You can program it to do anything you want. One of our friends, investors, customers is this guy, Justin Blau. He's a DJ. They have this company called Royal. This is just one concrete example. And what they do is they let artists, so let's say you're the Chainsmokers or Diplo or whoever it is, you can sell your song and everyone here can buy a piece of that song. And when Diplo makes money by people, you know, Spotify paying or whatever, you get paid out. So it's like you own a piece of a song, right? And like that was something that was never possible before. So long tangent, but the idea here is like when we have concrete real use cases that anybody in their daily life can use and don't even know it's crypto, that's what it's going to need to take off.
So diving back into the infrastructure layer, one thing that Tegan had mentioned was the multi-chain world. And want to actually spend some time on layer 1 blockchains. There seems to be a new one that's launching probably every month, and they're raising, you know, some hundreds of millions of dollars. So why are there so many new blockchains launching? And what's your guys' prediction on whether there's going to be consolidation in that space? And what's going to drive that? Maybe let's start with Bryan.
Yeah, I have like a reasonably strong opinion here, such that I think most of, right now, early on, there's just like one chain that anything happened on, and like that was Ethereum. And then you had a bunch of like iterative shades of that where maybe you were like 10% in this direction or 10% in that direction. And I think that over time, like as Ethereum scales, as other solutions scale, like that clearly is going to wash away. You're going to need like a stronger differentiator. So I think long term, like it's pretty clear that kind of the strongest orthogonal trade-offs will be the things that kind of get used the most. So the way that I think about it, I think about chains more like microservices these days than anything else, where like the it fundamentally changed the way applications were written online when you had microservices. Like originally we were just designing applications that like lived on a computer that sat in my house, and if I was lucky, maybe I would put it on a data center. And then you design something today, and you have things that are hyper optimized for storage and for compute and for everything else. And like this really opened up Netflix and like this huge brand of like consumer applications that we have today. And so you're getting the point where you have all of these chains that are really starting to specialize. You have things that are specialized in storage. You have things that are specialized in throughput. And if you add in a layer, like clearly I'm biased towards like interoperability, obviously, but like I think if you add in this layer, you have this ability to do something that's significantly more complex than you were ever able to do before. You have the ability to store, like you'll never be able to store everything you need on Ethereum for like a very complex like modern Web2 application, but like you could put a bunch of that storage on Arweave, and you could take that and bundle it up and do this very complex computation on Solana and like roll the result back, right? There's the ability to leverage each of these chains for these strengths rather than basically just using one and saying, based on the constraints of the system, like what can I do? And so I think there's this really interesting design space basically as all of this evolves, but I do think kind of either things that are like it has to be something that another chain is not going to do easily. I think it will lead much more towards hyper-specialization. Stephen was giving a great example before with like Ethereum and Arbitrum is a perfect example. So yeah, I do think we will see kind of an expansion where things are less similar and more focused on like their strongest differentiations.
Mm. And you had mentioned, in a world in which, if I have a MetaMask wallet and I can actually just buy an NFT directly in the Solana ecosystem, for example, that you're starting to abstract away that infrastructure layer and just have a better user experience. Do you feel that LayerZero is accelerating us towards that path?
Yeah, very much so. So, I think originally, like when people started thinking about bridges or started thinking about communication, it was purely like just on value transfer. Like some user has a bag of money and like let's bring it over there. But I do think the thing that I spend most of my time on these days is absolutely thinking about like abstraction at the consumer level. So right now this is when you do a transaction over LayerZero from chain A to chain B, like the user doesn't need to think about gas on chain A and gas on chain B. So you don't need to say have Ethereum, sign a transaction, switch your wallet to Polygon, get Matic in that wallet, claim the transaction, do all of these flows, right? For the consumer, it's one single transaction and everything happens. So this sort of opens up the space of wallets where you're not connecting to a single RPC, but you sort of have access to every RPC. You can sign a single transaction and have the layer below of chain, gas, all of these things sort of ultimately abstracted away from the end user, assuming you can do things like move gas on their behalf and all of these things, which is, again, all already bundled into kind of what we're doing. So I think working with developers, like one of the things they care about, like almost like we started in DeFi with like focusing on these really interesting financial primitives, which is like, what can we make? And that was totally fine. But like most people developing now are coming in to build consumer apps, and like what people building consumer apps care about is the fact that consumers use them, right? They want the application to be used. They want that to make that process as easy as possible. So if you're talking about how do we get the Robin Hood of crypto or Robin Hood to come to crypto and like do things here, right? Either of those outcomes, you need to be able to make that consumer experience the difference between, using your standard brokerage and like calling somebody up and asking for stocks and opening up your phone and just being like, yeah, I want to, go buy GameStop options or whatever that might be. So I think it's a huge inflection point of what people are looking for moving forward, and I think a focus on like UX and consumer apps is wildly underserved right now.
Let's talk a little bit about security. So in the multi-chain world, there's eye-opening hacks that happen, and they happen to happen more often on cross-chain bridges today. So I think over 600 million, stolen from the Ronin bridge, and then a couple hundred million from Wormhole. And in both these cases, the capital was actually returned to the users, which is terrific. But there's still a lot of trust that's, I think, broken from each time this happens. Why does this happen so often on cross-chain bridges? What is inherently about them that's difficult tech problem to solve, and what are some of the solutions out there?
Gonna make me just keep talking, huh? I think it's a couple of things. I think primarily almost every cross-chain bridge prior to today had used this thing of wrapped assets. So you would lock up an asset here, and you would mint a synthetic asset over there. And I think there's like this fundamental problem such that On most other things, you're doing a transaction and you have like risk exposure for the duration of the transaction, primarily, right? When you have wrapped assets, you want to have $10 billion of outflow from chain A to chain B. You lock up 10 billion here, you mint 10 billion of synthetics over there. You have standing risks now in perpetuity, as long as those synthetics exist. This 10 billion sits in that contract forever. You have risk at the consensus layer, you have risk at the smart contract layer, and sort of most of these things have been that catching up. So the Ronin hack was, I believe, I only looked into it briefly, but I think they had this gasless RPC, and it allowed the signers to basically forge a message and release it. So that was more towards like the consensus layer and how that's happening. This is how polynetwork hack happens as well. Wormhole was like there was a bug in the smart contract, but you had all these assets sitting there and nobody found the bug for a very long time. And then when it was found, it wasn't just in the duration of, okay, X is being transferred now. It was everything's still sitting there, let's just take it, right? And so I think one is like the way that people have been designing this, and then the other is just this sort of approach everyone has taken is broadly, and this is changing, but originally it was two chains want to communicate, let's just like stick our own chain in the middle, and like this will just tell the truth, right? Like we'll sign a transaction over here, this will figure out if that's right or not, and then it will tell the people over here, and like clearly that thing in the middle needs to be like as secure as both things, or like the sum of both things, or else you're going to get yourself into trouble. And so this hub and spoke model that has been tried time and time and time again has just, at the very least, the security has not scaled relative to like the growth of the external chains that it's connecting. And so I think that model as well has been like, tried and proven to not work successfully. I won't take the extra time here and kind of show how we're solving this. We are, but I think Steven has some thoughts on the topic as well.
Yeah, I mean, in Arbitrum or layer 2s, exactly, it's exactly this problem. You have two different chains of bridges, and basically a bridge is a way to say, hey, I locked assets here, and so unlock it on these chains. That's the way most of these bridges work. And the question is, to your point, who is the messenger? And the messenger needs to be as secure as really each of those chains, because the problem is an equivocation problem, right? I lock it on one chain, and I tell the other chain, hey, it's locked on Ethereum, please unlock it on Solana. But then I tell Ethereum, hey, I locked it on Solana, please unlock it on Ethereum, and now I've doubled my assets because both of these free the assets. And the critical problem here is the messenger. Who is delivering the message? Who is trusted to tell chain A that chain B is locked? And what happens if that messenger fails? And there are really good solutions being worked on, but I'll talk about how rollups solve this. The critical part in the cross-chain problem is that there needs to be this messenger, because chain A and chain B are not naturally in sync. If something happens on chain A, let's say Ethereum, Solana doesn't know about it. Someone needs to go and carry over that message. The really nice thing about rollups like Arbitrum is we're built on top of Ethereum. So there doesn't need to be a messenger. The two chains can talk directly. And the state of them is much more in sync. Now, of course, there's always software risks. There's always risks in bridges, but the risk surface is much smaller because you're able to cut out the messenger and have the two chains talk directly, and the equivocation risk therefore goes down significantly. And that's why one of the reasons I'm so excited about Arbitrum, and I think the cross-chain future that I'm excited about as a big Ethereum believer is many chains on Ethereum that all derive their security on Ethereum and are linked in a much closer way than, say, many different separate chains that need messengers to pass through. That doesn't mean I think in the short or medium term or even the long term necessarily there won't be other chains. So I think solutions like LayerZero are really critical to solving this problem. But thankfully in layer 2s like Arbitrum, it's a problem that we solve at the very root.
Can you theoretically extend the rollup technology for Ethereum to speak to another chain, like a Solana or a Near or someone else?
So we are, like, the Arbitrum technology, people ask me this all the time, like, I'm a very big believer in Ethereum, but that's a decision I make every single day because our technology is not super coupled with Ethereum. We could launch on any other chain, but the question that I ask ourselves is, where do we believe the future is? Where do we see the innovation? And we're strong believers in both the Ethereum technology, but also equally important in the Ethereum community. That's where the innovation is. Sometimes other chains will say, hey, I have this VM or this technical design which is better. And my response to that is, it might be better actually. Let's grant that it's better, but it doesn't matter because so much of the code and so much of the developer knowledge, if you're a company that wants to hire blockchain developer, you'll easily find a Solidity developer. You're not going to find a developer for something that's much, much better. If I had a clean slate today, I would not design Ethereum or the EVM like it is. But that doesn't matter. What matters is it's ingrained. If you're a developer, lots of developers, half their job is Googling and pasting together code snippets. Those code snippets, that corpus of code exists for Solidity, exists on Ethereum. So yes, we could take Arbitrum and launch on really any chain, with minimal or no differences depending on the technology of the chain, but we just are really, really strong believers in Ethereum. And as a small team, that's where our focus is, and that's where we believe the future will be. But again, it's a decision that's reborn every day because we're not tied at the hip to Ethereum. We're there because we believe in it. And every day we stay there is because we continue to believe in Ethereum. And I do believe in Ethereum. I think we'll stay there for a very long time.
Yeah, just quickly, when you think about these hacks and these exploits, it's generally where there is trust. And the term trustless, it's not a buzzword, right? Just like decentralization is not a buzzword, it's critical. You should eliminate the need to trust anything. And with these bridges, oftentimes there's validators, there's decentralized oracles, and then there's light clients. And I get really concerned around the security when it comes to a validator because the validators need to have more value locked than is being transferred across the bridge. Otherwise, their incentive is to collude. And so that's one piece that I think is critical when you do review the bridge space, kind of look to that trust model.
So the Ethereum ecosystem is the largest developer ecosystem in the world. Today, actually, by a large margin, although there are a lot of other blockchains that are competing in this space. Can you guys talk a little bit about how are these other Layer 1 blockchains, what are they doing to compete for developer attention? And in particular, a lot of them give token grants. Is this sustainable? And what's to prevent developers from just jumping blockchain to blockchain?
So my thoughts are that token grants are often really, really nice, but it has to come as sort of the icing on top of the cake. It shouldn't be the driver of your decision because you have to, for me, if I'm running a business, if someone gives me a grant, it's not going to be, I might want that grant, but I'm not going to fundamentally change the course of the decisions that I make for a grant generally, because it won't end well. You have to be principled and believe strongly in what you're doing and where you're building, and that's where you want to be. And then if you can get a grant to sort of help you, realize that vision that you have, that's really, really good. One thing we see, I'll take Arbitrum for example. We have hundreds of our apps on chain. We have about $4 billion of TVL on the chain today, and we've never given any project a grant. I can say I've never paid a project a penny to launch on Arbitrum. Now that doesn't mean that we never will. In fact, we are working on setting up a grant program. We're just early on. But the idea is the organic traction has to be there. We have developers, we have value coming because they believe in Ethereum, they believe in Arbitrum as the way to scale Ethereum, and they want their apps as principle number one, they want their apps on the blockchain that they believe will be here and will survive and will continue to be here. Now, a lot of them would be very, very happy if we give them a grant, but the grant shouldn't be the driving process. You have to really fundamentally believe. To quote Vitalik, money can't, to paraphrase Vitalik, money can't buy a soul for a blockchain. So you have to basically believe in what you're building, believe in the soul, and then sure, a grant is nice, and at Arbitrum, we're actively figuring out our grant program now, and we will do that. But the fact that we have an organic foundation, I think, is very strong. Because what happens is, if you give grants and there are no users or no developers, it doesn't end very, 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 very well, and the product basically doesn't have traction, and you basically want to be in the ecosystem where the users are and really where the other projects are, because so much of the ecosystem is cross application communication, and that you need to be sort of on the same ecosystem, on the same chain as these other players.
Yeah, I have very strong thoughts on this as well, and they very similarly mirror Steven's in that. I think one of the big problems, Ethereum has done as well as it has and created such a diehard community because everybody in it, early, was just pure ethos, right? Everyone was just excited to build this thing, to build on this thing. And one of the issues you see now with every single ecosystem giving these huge grants is you get extremely mercenary developers who are I'll just take the most popular thing there and fork it and I'll just run this thing here and that's great and I'll get paid $5 or $10 million or whatever it is to do that. But those aren't the people who are going to move your ecosystem forward long term. So we've very intentionally chosen not equally. We've given $0 to anybody. Again, eventually maybe we will. But I think the people you want early, you have people who come and very strongly believe in what you're doing in the technology, and they just get drowned out by everybody else who's just building and where everything is sort of money focused. And so I think the people you want building are the people who believe early in what you're doing and also are doing it because it meaningfully changes what they're doing and makes it better, right? It makes the thing that they're trying to do better. They're doing it because it's a value add to what they're doing rather than they're getting paid to doing it. And I think it's very important to like highlight those people early on and enable them and make sure it's not just complete noise.
Makes sense. Thanks so much, guys, for the chat. And these are the people who are helping us scale users on the blockchain from the tens of millions to billions. So thanks for all the work.
Thank you so much, Amy.
Thank you.